far from united. As those in power slither in black limos to broadcast their grievances to the world at the annual General Assembly, the list of crises seems to grow by the hour. The war in Ukraine, the rising cost of living, AI, deadly earthquakes, deadly floods, deadly fires, and the attendees can't even agree on the importance of the issues, let alone how to deal with them. With the countries of the Global South viewing the Ukraine war as a faraway European conflict. This year, out of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, only US President Joe Biden found time on his schedule to attend. French President Emmanuel Macron is staying home to host King Charles. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is also too busy, and China and Russia's leaders are no-shows as usual. Established after World War II, the UN was meant to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It failed to do so. We've seen over 250 armed conflicts since then, some of them greenlit by the UN in the name of peace. The theme for this year's general debate is rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity. But is that an achievable goal? Is there a way to reform the UN so it becomes a hope for humanity instead of a so-called den of dictators? Is the UN obsolete?
All right, gentlemen, let's get to it. Is the UN obsolete? As always, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we pick it up from there. So, Mr. Schaeffer, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me on. I wouldn't say that the UN is obsolete so much as it's been sidelined on matters of international peace and security. Russia and China use their vetoes. They paralyze the Security Council on issues of their concern, particularly Ukraine. North Korea and Iran defy UN resolutions with no ramifications. UN peacekeeping is obviously in retreat with missions closing down, particularly large-size missions. The UN does remain active in areas like development and climate. However, even here, you got substantial disagreements between the member states, and consensus action as opposed to rhetoric are pretty elusive. In my opinion, UN is most relevant in areas of technical areas like issuing standards from the International Civil Aviation Organization and similar bodies. Thanks.
Well, not dead on arrival, but deadlocked on arrival, so to speak, but we will dive in further to that in a split second. Mr. Carnelos, please, your thoughts.
Thank you. Well, the UN is almost 80 years old, and then probably a refitting is due. But not a fundamental change. It's easy to finger point at certain dysfunctionalities of the organization, but most of the critics largely ignore how much important work the US is still doing, especially in the humanitarian sector in supporting the most vulnerable. The real question is not if the UN is obsolete, but who is acting to make it so. And here we have the usual suspects. Don't forget, the UN works only if the 5 permanent members of this Security Council, US, Russia, China, UK, and France, allow it. As to the veto, I think that everybody has used the veto, and as far as I know, the country who used the veto most has not been the usual suspect we mentioned. Thank you.
All right, last but not least, Mr. Yaki Dayan, your take?
One of the main institutions that was built immediately after the Second World War, significant very much in re-establishment the State of Israel, ignoring that or recognizing the State of Israel. If we go today, I'm not sure that this resolution would have passed with so many non-democratic countries at the UN, in the Security Council. Countries like India and Germany are not part of that. And refugees, still only one problem of refugees, the Palestinian refugees, which you have so many other refugees. This institution has to be reformed. It was important, not anymore. Significant, it can be, but it has to be reformed.
All right, gentlemen, and from this point onwards, let's feel free to interact, to engage in a conversation. Mr. Schaeffer, I do want to begin with you. Maybe the UN, the format of the UN nowadays is simply incapable of action. Maybe the name of the game, low expectations or different expectations or no expectations at all.
Well, I don't know if it's so much different than it has been historically. If you look back during the Cold War, you saw most of these major peace and security issues handled outside of the UN system, largely in bilateral negotiations or negotiations between a handful of states that had to address those issues outside because the organization internally was largely frozen, paralyzed by the veto, as we saw on the situation with Ukraine, as we've seen in terms of responding to aggression by China in the South China Sea, as we've seen on any number of different issues involving North Korea or Iran or its violations of the UN Security Council resolutions detailing or pertaining to their nuclear activities. So the organization on these major issues historically was pretty frozen, and we've kind of returned to the first, say, 40 years of the organization's history rather than dramatically deviated from it. I think maybe the post-Cold War era, where the United States was the sole superpower and people saw the UN as a vehicle in which to address these issues, was probably a aberration rather than a restoration of the UN's original purpose.
And yet, Mr. Carnelos, from NATO to BRICS, maybe regional alliances or different format of alliances are replacing the international ones. Mr. Carnelos, can you hear us?
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't hear very well the question. Anyway, if the issue was related to the use of veto, I mean, this is anachronistic in my way. If the UN has to really reform, maybe we can maintain the permanent members or enlarge it. There are nations now like India, like Brazil, like Japan, like Germany that are legitimately claiming their role in the Security Council. Don't forget that the issue of the Security Council reform is going on since at least 30 years. And there's no agreement yet among the P5, the permanent members, who should be allowed in. But any reform would be basically a wasted opportunity if we continue to maintain the anachronism of veto that at the end of the day has paralyzed the organization. So let's go very democratically. Let's have a Security Council where the majority of the members
no veto
set
power.
Up what is legal and what is not. No veto power at all.
Mr. Dayan, what do you think? Should veto power be eliminated at the Security Council? Should it be expanded?
Listen, Israel has been so many times put on the agenda of the Security Council, and not rightly. I mean, the United States has used more than 40 times its veto power because almost all the discussions were dealing with Israel. So Israel is really being biased, or not biased, but Israel is being discriminated in the UN. So I don't want to see the United States losing their veto power. What I want to see is a huge reform in not only the Security Council, but in the entire UN. I think that it lost its relevancy in so many aspects, definitely security in other aspects. It has to focus, and focus maybe global warming. That's the issue today. This is something that the UN can lead. It can focus on such an issue, because on many other issues, such as security, such as refugees, so many other aspects, it lost its relevancy. It's very hard to achieve some kind of a consensus. And many times Israel is being discriminated there at the UN. So I don't want to see countries losing their veto, definitely not the United States, losing their veto power. I want to see the UN dealing with other issues that it can find its relevancy in the 21st century.
So, Mr. Schaeffer, COVID, climate change, etc. Maybe the UN rather, is incapable of action, but is it capable of reform through those, I would say, common ground topics?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I want to refer back a little bit to the discussion about eliminating the veto.
Please.
In order for any reform of the Security Council to go forward, especially as it pertains to the veto or the permanent members have to agree to that. They have to ratify that change to the UN Charter. And frankly, there's no way that any permanent member is going to give up their veto. Anytime a situation of significant and core interest to the member states, the permanent members of the Security Council, comes forward, they want to be able to dictate whether the UN addresses that or not. None of them are going to give up that authority. And in terms of expansion of the council, including new permanent members or additional vetoes, that's only going to make it more difficult to get things done in the Security Council, not less. So I think that people talking about reforming the UN Security Council and thinking that that is going to be an easy task or is going to be a task that's going to result in the Security Council operating more effectively might be in need of reassessing that opinion. In terms of the other matters on COVID, we saw that the UN reacted actually very poorly to COVID.
Yeah.
It echoed China's claims that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission for COVID. It praised China for being very cooperative and transparent. And we know that these things were not correct. And to hear the UN nowadays coming forward and saying and condemning countries and saying that they need to play a role in policing misinformation or disinformation, frankly, is a bit ludicrous. And we need to be actually focusing the organization in ways that it could be helpful. But I'm not sure that that putting it in a central role on policing speech or policing information, or perhaps addressing being the central actor in addressing future pandemics is necessarily a smart one, given its record.
Well, Mr. Dayan, COVID obviously perhaps not the best demonstration of UN cohesion or UN action. What about climate change? Maybe relevance can be regained through this endeavor?
Exactly, that's my thinking, because it has to be a global concerted effort, and Israel and the UN can take a role in such a global effort. In many other aspects, it lost its relevancy. It's comprised by countries that many of them are non-democratic countries. So how can a non-democratic country sit in the Human Rights Council of the UN? This is ridiculous, basically. It has to find its relevancy, and maybe that's the only field that it can invent itself.
Mr. Carnelos, before we take a short break, recap the first part of our discussion for us.
Well, I do it, but let me say very frankly, I'm a little bit sick of listening about the issue of misrepresentation and misleading carried out inside the UN. As far as I know, the biggest scam that took place in the Security Council has been the Iraq issue. And on that occasion where US and UK carried a flag of something that has become quite embarrassing for all the Western
Well, I suspect that if we look at the frequency of topics of the Security Council, this point can be proved. But we're taking a quick break, but we'll be back with more. Do not go anywhere. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Mr. Yaki Dayan, Mr. Marco Carnelos, and Mr. Brett Schaeffer. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to our conversation, maybe the UN losing its clout to an extent is merely a symptom. Let's cross now live to New York. I-24 News senior U.S. correspondent Mike Wagenheim in the quarters of right outside the UN building there. Mike, what's shaking? Yes, all right. We have some technical difficulties to speak with Mike, so let's get straight back to it. Gentlemen, with you, another quick fire round, 30 seconds each. Maybe the age of liberal democracy is coming to an end. And again, as alluded to before, the UN merely a symptom. Marco Carnelos, your 30 seconds are on. Please take the lead. Yeah.
I'm afraid so, sadly, although its demise appears quite slow. And let me say, the reason has nothing to do with the rise of autocracies, as Western powers and their mainstream media want us to believe. Liberal democracy is imploding because of its own hubris and serious mistake, because of its double standards, because of its rules based applied biasly, its hyper-financialization of the economy, its inequality, and for its fundamental inability to deliver good governance to its own citizens and to the rest of the world, unfortunately.
All right, Yaki Dayan, your thoughts?
I hope not. Liberal democracy is the separation of powers, independent judiciary, check and balances between the different branches of government. And what we see now in Israel is a major fight for liberal democracy. We see how much the Israelis want to maintain their liberal democracy. So maybe that's a fight not only for Israel, but for the entire world.
Mr. Brett Schaeffer, last but not least, your thoughts.
I also hope we don't see that demise, but there's definitely a negative trend. Freedom House, which measures political liberties and civil rights around the world, has noted that there's a decline in global freedom for 17 consecutive years now. The past couple of years, we've seen a number of different coups, especially in Africa. However, I think it's worth noting that free democracies have been a minority in the UN for decades. And authoritarian governments like China, Cuba, Russia, and Iran are very influential in the UN system and have no qualms against recognizing and working with those authoritarian governments. And they use their influence to undermine efforts in the UN to promote democracy and also to shun authoritarian governments.
So, gentlemen, please feel free to interact, to engage in a conversation. And to that point exactly, Mr. Carnelos, is the great power competition, if you will, making the UN less or more important? How is it playing a role in the overall power struggle?
The great power competition is a reality, and unfortunately is making the UN less and less relevant. I think we all agree on this point. But let me repeat again, it's not a fault of the United Nations in itself. The United Nations, it's a summatory, it's a group of wills that should match each other. But basically, if the rules are carried out in the way they are carried out, the organization will continue to be irrelevant. Essentially, it's not democratic. We are talking about democracy, freedom, all fine. We all support that. But we are relying on an organization that, by its rules, democratic. Inside the General Assembly, unfortunately, the rules were established to make it irrelevant, because General Assembly resolution usually has no burden and don't carry the weight, unfortunately.
Mr. Dayan, chime in, please.
I think that what we see now is kind of a cold war between liberal democracies that also fight internally for the liberal democracies, countries such as the United States and Israel, and non-democracies like China and Russia and North Korea and Iran. There is a major fight for our values, and I think that each country has to take a stand, defend it internally, but also externally. And what we see now is a major fight between those values, no doubt.
If we're looking ahead, Mr. Schaeffer, I do have a radical suggestion here. Maybe non-state actors or non-state entities, rather, should be incorporated into the UN to regain relevance.
Well, there is a mechanism for allowing NGOs and civil society to participate in the UN. My organization, the Heritage Foundation, actually is an ECOSOC accredited organization with the United Nations. And there are some 4,000 plus NGOs that actually can participate in the UN deliberations as civil society groups. They don't have votes, but they can participate in meetings and they can make comments to the member states. And I think that that is an appropriate thing, because NGOs, as important as they are, and as insightful as they can be, are not governments, and they don't represent people in the same way. They're constituencies, and so they should have a voice, but they should not have the same status as governments, because governments are there to represent their people. And unfortunately, we have a situation in the world where a lot of authoritarian governments repress their people rather than represent them, and that is a flaw in the international system. And it allows authoritarian governments to abuse the UN in many ways. And as the other speaker was noting earlier, Israel is often the brunt or the target of a lot of this discriminatory treatment in the UN Human Rights Council, but in other parts of the UN as well. And so it's I think it's incumbent upon the United States and other governments to try and promote liberal democracy and to try and promote mechanisms inside the system so that those abuses can be minimized to the extent possible.
All right, then in the short time we've left, perhaps as Mr. Schaeffer is circling us back to our discussion on Israel and the UN Security Council. Yaki Dayan, you've heard Mr. Carnelos earlier. I assume you would like to respond.
Listen, we see how biased is the Security Council and most of the UN councils and organizations against Israel. I mean, again, as I said in my opening remarks, I'm not sure that if the reestablishment of the State of Israel would have gone today to the UN, and they would have voted for the reestablishment of the State of Israel. We are facing a situation that non-democratic countries are the majority at the UN, and this is definitely not the picture that we want to see, definitely in an international important organization. So unless it will be reformed significantly, the UN would lose. It's already losing its credibility, but it would definitely lose its minimum credibility or relevancy that it has right now.
Mr. Carnelos, the time has come again. Wrap it up for us, sir.
Well, let me say from my modest experience, I have 5 years at the UN. I never saw a better country better shielded, at least in the Security Council, than Israel.
Yeah.
And I'm glad it was. But having said that, the overall situation is quite different. As to the NGO, is right. They better express, in my view, civil society and certain constituencies than their own. But I believe you agree with me that how we select the NGOs and how many we have to admit. Of course, there are tools to make them relevant in the UN, but their simple admission is impossible because an already, in a way, dysfunctional organization would become a bubble. And I don't think we can afford that.
Well, at this pace, the non-state actors would be Meta and Google and X. But maybe we have a few years until then. Now, gentlemen.
No.
No.
Better not to happen.
Clear no.
AI, completely UN AI.
Well, that would save a lot of money, right? Less money spent on treats for all the diplomats. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, for your insight. We appreciate it. Hey, I see you liked it. Want more? Just hit the subscribe button right here. Go on. I know you want to.